Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats. You get bonus points for the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. My name is Ian Wallace. I run the Cybersecurity Initiative here at New America alongside my colleague Ross Schulman of the Open Technology Institute. For those of you who don't know us, New America Cybersecurity has existed for nearly 3 years. Started originally using a grant from the DiploFoundation, for which we are very grateful. And now our international work is supported by an exciting new partnership with Florida International University that we hope to build on, particularly on the capacity building side in the course of the next couple of years. Central to that work, as I suggested, is is around cybersecurity in general, internet capacity building. And what we've found as we've dug into that is that that work is now very closely aligned to governance, both how countries govern and how they think about how the internet should be governed. And in the fairly recent past, not too long ago, internet governance had a very specific meaning, a very narrow meaning. And it still does, of course, and we're going to dig into some of that. But we also, particularly in the last year, have seen a shift in the relationship between governance and the internet. Part of that reason, I think, is because information systems are increasingly becoming pervasive, both in depth, in terms of sort of what they touch within our daily lives, but also in breadth, in the number of countries and places where you can expect those information systems to operate. And therefore, the question is not so much how do you govern the internet, but how do you govern in the age of the internet? And that sort of hits at some basic truths about how governments work, quite apart from how the internet works. But at the same time, it bumps up against some very real and significant issues of what it means to keep the internet alive and operating in the way that we've come to expect. And how do you reconcile that challenge with sort of the practicalities versus the very real concern of governments of keeping control of their societies. So those are the sort of issues that we're going to try and dig into today. To get to the sort of meat of some of those questions, I am joined by an all-star panel who I will briefly introduce. Firstly, on my left, I have Jovan Kurbalija, thank you, who is the director of the DiploFoundation and the head of the Geneva Internet Forum, and has had a long career as a diplomat and particularly focused on sort of cyber diplomacy, advising many high-level groups at the UN and in the multi-stakeholder community. Next to Jovan, we have Megan Stifel, who is the Cybersecurity Policy Director at Public Knowledge and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She was previously the director of the International Cyber Policy at the National Security Council in the White House, and a long-time cyber policy advisor at DOJ. And next to Megan, Sean Kanuck, who is now the director of the Future Conflict and Cybersecurity Program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and doubles up as the chair of the Research Advisory Group of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which Sean might tell us a little bit more about in due course. He has had, until fairly recently, a sort of decade and a half in the US government, including 5 years as the US's first National Intelligence Officer for Cyber. And last but certainly not least, we have Jane Coffin, who is the Director of Development Strategy at the Internet Society, which I assume is familiar to most, but she can perhaps tell us a little bit more about ISOC in due course. and she comes to that from background of doing internet policy at the US Commerce Department, and also worked in USAID in a past life. In terms of format, we are going to have a conversation up here on stage, and then as we get going, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. If people have a sort of question, then please hold it back. We will get to you in due course, but I think we'll cover most, at least set this up fairly well in the next half an hour or so. For those of you who are among the Twitterati, the New America Twitter address is @NewAmCyber. I don't think we have a hashtag for this, but feel free to use the hashtag #NewAmCyber. And if anyone is watching online and would like to ask a question, please do so, and we will make sure your question gets raised. Okay, kicking off, we'll start with Jovan. What are the trends that you see in internet governance and governance relating to internet issues that are going to frame the conversation going forward, and how is that different to what we've dealt with in the past?
Thank you, Jan, for organizing this panel, and it's great to be here in Washington with so many friends in audience and fellow panelists. And well, it's always great to speak about the future. Future is tolerant. Whatever we say will be somehow viewed with a sort of a necessary time distance. And as famous saying goes, it's difficult to make a prediction, especially about future. But we'll try to make a few indications what's going on and what is ahead of us for what we can call it digital autumn. The weather is not going to be as nice as it is today in Washington, D.C. They will be cloudy. We won't have the hurricanes, but we'll have definitely some strong winds and some new dynamics into the weather system of digital policy and internet governance. Now, when you ask me to outline the main trends, I basically combine intuition, what all of us are doing, reading, consulting, and more evidence-based sources which we collect every month on the trends in digital policy at Geneva Internet Platform. We have 60 curators all over the world who are following, and you will see why I'm highlighting it, local developments in digital policy. We are sometimes too focused on the developments that you can consult in New York Times, The Economist, and the main newspapers, or in academia, which is circulating this field. But there are quite a few substantive developments happening outside, we can call it circle of usual suspects, including myself. I will try to outline, I started with 10 trends, but I said, okay, that will be too many. Then I moved to 3, you know, famous Aristotelian French, everything has to be in 3. Then I had to add 1 trend, therefore there will be 4 trends that I will try to outline. And the first one is what we can call it shift towards digital realism, a realpolitik, what is happening, I think, big time in international relations. Second trend is the moving towards the local digital policy. The third trend is on the digitalization of non-core internet areas like health, migration, humanitarian trade. And fourth trend is basically the trend that courts are starting to run global digital policy. Courts are becoming, in a way, norms shapers. And I will just elaborate on these 4 trends quickly, and then I hope it can introduce discussion. What is the digital realpolitik? What is basically happening? For those of you, and I can see quite a few of you who have been in internet governance for quite some time, you can recall that digital policy and internet governance had always this interplay between values and interests. Core values, in particular promoted by civil society, technical community on openness, inclusiveness, transparency, and interest, in particular promoted by governments and business sector. Now, obviously, there are interplays. Sometimes interests are camouflaged as the values, but this was the part of the show which has been going for the last 15 years. What we have been noticing in particular over the last 6 months, is a huge shift from value-centered approach to the clear interest-centered approach. In particular, governments and businesses are going towards the bottom line and seeing what is in it for me, whether it is the cybersecurity policy, e-commerce, and that trend is clear and it has been gaining momentum, and it is quite certain that it will be one of the dominant trends in global digital policy. Practically speaking, what does it mean? It means that the negotiation on UNGG unfortunately failed because of the too strong push towards Realpolitik and direct interest of the main players with the lower focus on sort of commonality and common interests. Governments are a particularly interesting player because they're looking for control of their information space. We can call it cyber sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and I'm sure that sovereignty will be one of the topics that we'll be referring to, which is coming with the different motivations. Some governments are doing it for censoring the policy space, but there are increasing number of governments who are witnessing the situation in which they cannot rule anymore. Max Weber, German sociologist, did an excellent analysis of bureaucracy and the way how governments function. And the key commodity for governments in order to perform their function is information. Suddenly, governments are out of the control of the information, and they started being nervous that they cannot govern and rule anymore. In cybersecurity field, in e-commerce, taxation, you name it and you have it. Therefore, there are this second group of governments, I would say mainly European governments, who are trying to regain that space of the core government's function around the question on information. What is going to happen with this trend? Most likely, we'll have the strong shift towards that traditional policy and a gradual withdrawal of the what we called multi-stakeholder and inclusive policy ahead of us, definitely over the next 6 months to 1 year. There are good and bad news. For all of us who invested a lot of time in inclusive digital policy, that would be definitely set back. On the more positive side, there will be more realistic basis of global digital policy. We will know what are the interests of the key players. And I'm optimistic that some sort of compromise will be found. What we found recently with Uber case, city authority in London, as you know, tried to ban the use of Uber, but then users signed the petition, 500,000 users signed petition requiring some sort of solution. Therefore, all players around the table, governments, business, civil society, will have interest to preserve the internet dynamism from various angles: economic development, security, business model, access to the internet. Therefore, I'm more optimistic that something will come out of this shift towards digital Realpolitik that we will have over the next 1 or 2 years, more reality-based, sort of not in negative sense, but reality-based digital policy. This is the first major trend. The second trend which is emerging is that internet governance is getting local. And here I will introduce one very dangerous bias that internet governance and digital policy, I'm using interchangeable digital policy, internet governance community has developed. The saying goes like this: internet is global, therefore internet governance has to be global. And it sounds logical, it sounds obvious, but when you really dig into the digital policy, you realize that yes, internet is global. Now the colleagues are following this session from all over the world, will be able to exchange information. But what is happening is that impact of the internet is very local, given the social, economic, policy, cultural context. Therefore, the internet policy will be increasingly local. The best analogy of this development is with climate change. In 2009, in Copenhagen, climate change community wanted to make, I call it, naive global compact. It failed, as you know. It took the climate change community 6 years to have a proper deal in Paris. And one of the underlying points is that they went through the local and the regional arrangements in order to recreate the new global deal. I fear that we will have some sort of development, similar development in internet governance. And if I can put the provocative question, we may not need digital United Nations, we may need digital United Regions. A lot of digital policy is happening in regions. And there are interesting cybersecurity in different digital commerce. There are different developments on the regional level. Third major development, which is quite shaped by my experience in Geneva, is digitalization of traditional policy areas. It already started 6 or 7 years ago with security. We have now a major stream on cybersecurity. It's happening in trade, in health, migration, and other fields. Therefore, you have communities which are addressing more or less the core issues of internet governance from completely different angle. One example is data. Data is discussed in WTO as free flow of data and the prerequisite for digital economy. In the Human Rights Council as the question of privacy. In the International Standardization Organization, question of standards. In the WHO, World Health Organization, question of protection of data, health data. And more or less in all of these organizations, they're discussing similar topic from different perspectives. Famous word, policy silos, policy silos are emerging, and we are getting quite a lot of confusion among these policy silos. Therefore, that will be one of the major trends, how to follow the shift of digital policy from the usual suspect circle of III, ICANN, ITU, IGF, towards the wider space. And the last trend is basically that internet governance is increasingly run by courts. All of us are familiar with the decisions, the court decision of European Court of Justice on right to be forgotten. Now we are waiting for the court decision on the Uber transportation on information company, which will have enormous impact on the future of the sharing economy. And this trend is interesting, and the main player is European Court of Justice, but we are seeing it in Canada, we are seeing it in the United States, we are seeing it in Indonesia, Brazil, various places where courts are getting the more important role. And one can ask, what is the reason for this trend? The reason is very simple. Individuals, citizens, internet users, companies have to address their legal concerns, and they have a right to justice. They go to the courts, and they ask courts to rule on their concrete problems. Unlike us in internet governance and other policy spaces, judges cannot establish another working group, you know how it is going in the UN. When you have a problem, you establish the next working group or a government group of experts. They have to rule. They have to make judgments. And those judgments they do quite substantive consultation. They bring experts into the process, but still, those judgments are suboptimal in comparison to the inclusive multidisciplinary or multi-stakeholder policy. Those are 4 trends which, based on our research and Geneva Internet Platform, we identified as probably trends that will mark the next 6 months to 1 year.
Dystopian future where lawyers make all the decisions is terrifying. Speaking of which, Megan, we've heard some fantastic sort of suggestions on sort of where the future of the internet sort of may be going. From your perspective, sort of coming out of government, now working in sort of civil society, where do you see kind of the future taking us on in this particular area?
I'll begin with the similar thanks that Jovan offered to Ian and the company for the opportunity to join you all this morning. Pardon me for my mic. I endorse Jovan's forecast, which is partly cloudy with a chance of a few bright moments, but probably not blizzards, but problems. So I guess maybe I can take a step back and observe sort of where things have been over the past year to think about how that's influencing the next 6 months to a year. And I would sort of identify 3 or 4 trends or characteristics that I think the future conversation will be responding to in the way that it evolves. The first is this idea of the vulnerability of major platforms and intermediaries. So certainly we can think of the misuse of platforms like Facebook and Twitter to influence. Obviously, certainly here in the US, we are sensitive to the way that what we're learning about what happened with the US election last fall. But we also know from our European colleagues that there have been some challenges abroad as well. Similarly, you can look at the vulnerability of not just the social media platforms, but also some of the communications platforms like Yahoo. We've seen Yahoo intruded upon and Sean can probably address that too. I would also just quickly note the idea that we're moving a lot of things to the cloud, but Amazon, not to pick on Amazon per se, but we've seen a number of security breaches from companies that are using cloud services, and Amazon is one that quickly came to mind. So I think this idea that some of these new-ish institutions and, as I said, intermediaries are in some ways the way of the future, but we're beginning to see slight cracks in the shiny path. And I think we really need to be careful about the way we respond to that, because for those who've looked at the way the Western world has approached this conversation, internet governance, and the way that some of our other counterparts have, there has been a discussion over a decade, Sean can correct me, since he's been advising GGE work for a long time, this notion of information security. So depending on the way we respond to issues of the misuse of platforms, weaknesses, and things like DDoS events, we can quickly, I think, find ourselves in a trap that may present an opportunity for those who think that information security is the right approach to managing the internet, can seize upon that opening to try and drive for a more multilateral approach to so-called internet governance. And I don't think that most of us, I'll speak for myself only, think that that's the way we want things to go for a number of reasons that I won't run through because I think they're all pretty familiar to many of us. I also just want to highlight one other vulnerability, which is something that hopefully Jane can talk to a little bit more, what we've seen in Spain in the past week. We're thinking about, essentially, it's unclear to me what process in a legal sense was used, if there was any process beyond a prosecutor saying, please go take that domain. But that's a weakness in a system that, again, if we're not able to try and vector and think strategically about how we respond to it, could easily, I think, wind us up in a road a few years from now that's not.
And just for the sort of general audience, can you just give a little bit of a picture of what happened in Spain in the last week?
I'll attempt to, and Jane can correct the record maybe. So there's as I understand it, an election coming up. There is a group in Catalonia that is opposed, I think, the current regime and have used the .cat domain as a platform to present alternative views. And a prosecutor, or possibly, and I think a mayor, were involved in arresting the administrator of the domain and essentially, I'll use the word seizing the content, but forcing them to find an alternative platform to host their information, which is now off of the .cat domain. I think it's on .eu. So I have a number of, I don't want to get too far down the tangent on this, but among the reasons that's problematic is Spain is a member of the Freedom Online Coalition, which means that they, when they joined up, agreed to protect online speech as it would be protected in offline. So again, I think we need to be unilateral, I'll use that phrase, it may not have been unilateral, but unilateral action by countries that we think are partners in approaching this as a multi-stakeholder area, again, potentially can lead us into a trap that fractures in our allegiance are problematic. So that's one sort of issue I think that will potentially impact the conversation going forward. The second is exhaustion and scarcity. And by that I mean, I was talking to one of Jane's colleagues, and the person said to me, the iStars in that community are still just exhausted. They got through the IANA transition process, but unfortunately there's a scarcity of people who have the capacity and the knowledge to manage some of these more technical issues. And that speaks to, I know, work that the New America New America is working on, as well as we are at Public Knowledge, which is trying to build a greater capacity, technical capacity among civil society, but also among governments to understand where we are now in a post-IANA transition world and how we can best continue to maintain the platform in an open, maybe regionally open process. The other piece of exhaustion is, I think, particularly for the US space, but also potentially globally, is kind of on the negative forecast. We see reports, including a Pew study recently, that talk about the increasing concern over privacy. And I think we've reached, particularly in the US, an exhaustion where people just assume that their data is not secure. That's particularly problematic, obviously, for a country like the United States that has many of its citizens have their information stored somewhere else. It's in someone else's custody, so to speak. But as we move to bringing more and more users online, we, I think, need to take a serious look about how we're going to manage privacy for these newer online global citizens. So, you know, as I think most people in the room may know, there was a significant data breach recently by Equifax, which is essentially a data broker. I'll try to be diplomatic. And the concern for many is that in the US, there was the users whose information were, the consumers whose information was stored by Equifax was not something that they had a choice in their information being held by this particular repository, because we don't entirely follow the FIPS approach to information. So I think in the coming months, we may return to a conversation about privacy, both from governmental actors, but also from corporate actors. The last, on a higher, sort of a more positive note, we're about 2 years post-transition, and by all means, from a technical vantage point, at least from where I sit, we've been fairly stable. The internet is still working. This great experiment worked. The key rollover was successful. Most people don't even know what that is. I'm not going to even try to define it. One of my other colleagues will, but I can tell you that it was important that it went as well as it did. And so I think, you know, while we have these sort of negative or pessimistic or problematic challenges in the immediacy, we need to go back to where we began and think about the fact that the hierarchy and the platform that continues to grow, but was started 50 years ago, and its technical elements works. So we need to figure out how to manage the people factor behind it. That includes corporations, but also governments, all of us as stakeholders. So I'll wrap up with that.
Thank you. We're going to come back to many of those points. But Sean, you spent much of your career in government, and that's where you focused. What do you see going ahead, the sort of key issues affecting not just the US government, but governments around the world generally?
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you to New America for the opportunity to speak with you all here in Washington and in the online community. And I would like to pull that thread based on my Intel experience as an analyst, and then in my current role at IISS on the strategic interstate side of things. So I think the key trends that Jovan mentioned are definitely the appropriate ones to be thinking about. I'd love to explore the localization and the court impact a little further, but I personally want to draw on the first one, the Realpolitik, because that's the area I play on, and the ladies on each side of me are much better suited than I am to talk about the civil society of things. So when I think about the future of the internet and the trends from that Realpolitik side, I start with the question of global interoperability. What is the issue we're discussing? Where would the potential impasse be? I offer that it is not at physical connectivity. I can maybe think of 2 countries who don't want extensive connectivity at the physical layer, where you can actually be connected in. Is it at the technical functionality or technical standard level? Largely not. We have major standardization protocols that are widely adopted, and even where they're not perfectly adopted, you have commercial solutions that allow you to bridge between the 2 that are being used, sort of like a roundhouse between 2 different gauge railways, if need be, at some of these international gateway routers. So what is the real impasse that we're discussing here? It's about political and economic regulation. That means it's voluntary, and it's led by nation states, whether it's through courts, executive action, or police power in its various formats, but it really comes back to sovereignty. So the question is, are nations going to be trying to enforce sovereignty for personal advantage? And for me, that was a little bit of the kernel from Jovan's first trend that I want to underscore. So when I look at what happened at the UN, I completely agree that we came to the furthest point as an international community of where the agreement and the fig leaves and the polite diplomatic conversation could go, and we really unearthed a fundamental disagreement about what governments want out of the internet. You have some countries who are looking at it from a national security and political regime stability status. You have others who are looking at it largely or primarily as an economic innovator and engine. And you have others that are looking at it as a possibility of development and social opportunity. I do a lot of work in India, and I hear them talk about this three-pronged triangle between cost effectiveness, access, and human rights. And then somewhere dancing around all three of those is security. Okay? How do you bring 1 billion people online and try to provide social services, making sure that it's not commandeered by criminals or a foreign nation state, protecting a delicate balance of human rights in the world's largest democracy, but also a varied, multicultural, multilinguistic environment where they've already had the example of fake news, a fake tweet getting replicated and causing 1 million people to migrate out of fear for physical harm coming to their families in the Northeast. Compare that to the conversations you hear at oftentimes in the UNGGE meetings or in the bilats between the United States and China or the United States and Russia, where it's at a much different political and security level when you're getting those candid conversations. So in addition to those incongruities between what different nation states are going to be seeking in this place, of course, it's not just limited to nation states. You've got private actors who are even more capable in certain respects than some of the nation states who are trying to govern, and I'm going to put that in quotes because I don't think anyone really is governing it in the way they would want. It brings me back to an analogy to outer space and how space law first developed. It was from a very Realpolitik approach. At that point, there were two nations who could put satellites up, and they determined what was in the interest and how the rules of the road were set. So if we ask ourselves, who can, not who wants to, not who should, but who can affect this environment? It's going to be nation states with the police power and the will to enforce it. What are these court rulings without an executive power that says, yes, our court should be ruling on this, and who's willing to have the police go enforce that court ruling? That's where the rubber's going to meet the road. In the United States, remember what happened in the Microsoft case where the Department of Justice was demanding information about users who had originally registered through Ireland. Okay? That's going through a legal process. The police power has not raided Microsoft's offices. Think about the Apple case with the Department of Justice and the San Bernardino shooter's phone. Was Apple raided the way we see offices in other countries? No, but then the burden was placed on the government. Well, at what point does that willingness, where do we find the balance between where the burden is put on the public or the private companies? And it's incredibly important when you think about your large telecommunications providers, your internet service providers, and increasingly your cloud providers. When you ask me who can, I'm increasingly saying private sector names rather than the who wants, which are usually ministry of this, department of that. I'll leave you with one thing that was on our pre-notes discussing, I'm sure it'll come up here. Look at the normative, the policy proposal coming from a company like Microsoft for a new digital Geneva Convention. Now, I have personal analytic questions about how that's been framed and what, if anything, were to come of it, what it would eventually look like. But for a private sector entity with global reach, who's mired in numerous political discussions, again, for a euphemism, in multiple countries because they're a multinational company dealing with business opportunities all over the world, to basically trying to set the standard for how interaction should be occurring, what acceptable and unacceptable behavior should be. I look at the Facebooks and the Twitters who have their own corporate censorship policies. I had the opportunity to ask one social media company when they were discussing their terrorism blocking policy. I said, so that clearly presumes a definition of terrorist or terrorism. Do you use the UN Security Council list? Do you use the United States State Department list? Are you using some other list? So now you have corporate bodies, governance boards, who are obliged fiduciary duties to shareholders around the world who are trying to set policies for free speech on their platforms. And then, of course, you can always have the throwaway comment, well, if you don't like the policies of this social media provider, go start your own that allows Falun Gong or allows white supremacy or whatever else. Well, easier said than done in an economy of scale world. So I note all these tensions, but as we go into our group discussion here, I want to underscore Realpolitik 4 times. I think that is the leading trend. And for me, it comes down to the governments who want to, how willing are they to go with enforcing their police power to get what they want? And then in the private sector, what are their incentives and motivations and end objectives? Because at the end of the day, it's they who really can, unless the police come in and take over their office in whatever country it may be.
Sean, thank you. Again, a lot to chew on. But before we get into the detail, Jane, ISOC has been in the space forever, and yet sort of the world has clearly changed a lot in the time that ISOC have been around. How do you and, for want of a better phrase, the internet community see the weather forecast?
Thank you very much also for having us here today. I work for the Internet Society, otherwise known by some as ISOC, ISOC. We've been around for 25 years. We just celebrated our 25th year last week at a huge celebration. I have to put in a plug, sorry for that. Also another shameless plug for a report we just issued called Paths to Our Digital Future. It is timely that we're here because this is about the future stability, growth, development, inclusiveness of the internet. So many of the things that everyone on the panel has said are all of the things that we stand for as far as inclusiveness, interoperability of technology, openness of debate, inclusion of people, stakeholders throughout the discussion, and transparency. And the key thing that relates to all of this is collaboration as well and partnerships. So I work mostly with development of internet infrastructure in developing countries. And so I'm a community builder working with people to build internet exchange points, something mind-numbing for some of you who don't know technology probably, but it's exchange of traffic in an open manner in a country so that you don't have to send your traffic out to another country to exchange it inside and talk to each other. The other is community networks. They're bottom-up, citizen-built, run, and managed networks. These are a trend in many countries now and developing more and more due to the fact that there isn't infrastructure in many countries. So I'm going to riff off that for a second because we're talking at a high level of, cross-border data flows and whether or not there's access or not. And I've been in many countries where governments are saying, because of cybersecurity, we need to shut off that data flow. We need to re-monopolize those gateways, international gateways. Been there, seen it, watched it, used to live in the former Soviet republics for 5 years. We've got to watch this space because it means that data can't come in. There isn't interoperability of some of the systems because they're trying to create that through the technical side. And you can't have multiple partners exchanging traffic over borders. That's tricky. If you're monopolizing that gateway, you run down a rat hole of more state control. So the question is, at that basic level, we need to still continue to build that infrastructure, build those communities. So for many of you, I was just in Cote d'Ivoire a couple weeks ago. We're still having this debate about building out infrastructure, exchanging traffic with each other, which builds up to more of the citizen level of, do people have access to information as well? So we focus our work right now on access and trust. So I want to bring back also on this trust theme with respect to its trust in the infrastructure. Megan mentioned Equifax. I've been caught in, I think, 3 breaches. Once when I was in the government, once when my credit cards were stolen. I was told each time by the FTC to go register with Equifax and or any of the other 2 companies. There are 3 companies, right? So recently I saw this breach and I said, so when does my data become irrelevant to some people? I mean, it's been out on the black market maybe. I don't think I'm that important perhaps, but there are other people that are. So how do we protect each other? And can we? Because there's some fear and there's some helplessness here. There's a great article in the New York Times on Saturday in the business section about this. Over 2,000 pings were felt by this guy in his email. And he said, this has been the key trend, fear and helplessness. So is that where we want to be as people using infrastructure? I certainly don't. And if I don't have control over my own data, what next? That was one of the key themes from our report is inclusiveness in human people participating in the process. So from a civil society perspective, how do you create a bottom-up governance type of inclusion in this debate? Whether it's from a cybersecurity perspective, development of infrastructure, creation of that infrastructure. So it's human rights perspective, continuing that end-to-end operability of the internet. This is something Vint Cerf who's one of our founders. He's a father of the TCP/IP with Bob Kahn. Those were the creators of the Internet Society, some of them. So the key technical aspect of end-to-end interoperability. Are we looking, as Jovan said about regional, are we siphoning off the internet into blocks? We going back to the old telco model, where it's not end-to-end operability, where it's state to state. That is something that has been a trend in some of the UN organizations to try and protect that infrastructure. So I'm working at the practical level, building that infrastructure, building communities to support it. And at the Internet Society, we want to see more inclusiveness, all stakeholders having a certain voice. So how do you break into the UN conversation if you're us? We go, we participate, we try and meet people, but it's a hard road if you're civil society working with the UN organizations, right? We're going to a meeting in 2 weeks called the World Telecom Development Conference. We are a member of the ITU, the development sector and the standard sector. We can sit in the back of the room. We're allowed to speak if we're called on. So luckily we know a lot of people in the room, but if you're not allowed to speak as civil society and people that know both the technology development, the economics, the governance discussions from the bottom up, then how do you inform that debate? So from a very practical perspective, we work around the world with lots of our chapters. We have about 120 chapters. These are incarnations or people that believe from a principle-based perspective in what ISOC does. And we work with them to talk about the technology, the development, and the governance aspects, to build that infrastructure, to talk about how people have a right to discuss issues and bring their own perspective. Megan mentioned Catalan. I have to put in a pitch here. We have put out a statement from our regional bureau director for Europe. It's a complicated situation with DOCAT right now. One of the technical experts has been arrested. He was released yesterday, but he was arrested on Tuesday, and he wasn't sure why he was arrested. And I was talking to Larry Strickling, who's a former boss of mine, in the back of the room. I asked him, what is sedition, Larry? Because I'm not a lawyer. And quite frankly, the fellow was arrested on terms of sedition related to secession. And it's a very highly political issue in Catalan. We're not getting in the middle of that debate with the government of Spain and their territories. But the question is, when you start to arrest technical experts who work at a top-level domain because of a website that was put up for a referendum, that's a voice that these people want to have so they can speak. So you're arresting a technical expert for putting up a website? So the question is, are we reaching that point from a civil society and a governance perspective where there isn't a voice? It's just a takedown. I will say that the referendum website went up under .eu right away. So the question is, what is the European Union going to do if Spain comes to them and says, take down the site? This is a very simple site about the referendum, just the right to speak. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Jane. There is an enormous amount of information apart from anything else, but also beneath the surface, a lot of ideas and sort of technical detail apart from anything else. But I want to sort of step back and start to try and draw links between some of the trends that we've heard. And I think one of the things that I take from what we've heard is that we've now reached a period in time where there are just so many trends swimming around, sometimes bumping into each other, sometimes diverging, that it's very difficult even for experts to get their head around where we want to go in the future, let alone where we think we're going to go in the future. So Jovan, just to take your initial point about a shift to sort of Realpolitik away from values. Values, of course, still remain important, not least to anchor the ideas that we have for where we want to get to. So in terms of potentially values, but also other markers for the sort of, if you like, pegs in the ground, what do you think the sort of framing ideas ought to be around which we can navigate some of these trends?
Well, the first point is always to recognize reality, and Sean and I completely share this point, and that's the starting point. And as I indicated, I'm more optimistic than this weather forecast looked in our introductory presentations, because the reason for optimism is, for example, the reaction of the Uber users in London. And it is governments have sovereignty over their space. They can do whatever they want within the international limits of international law. But when you really analyze what are their possibilities, they're limited because there are vested interests of grandmas connecting via Skype to her family across the ocean. There are various instances, from Uber users to grandmas to the Facebook users. Dependence on the internet economy is huge, and I think that's what Sean indicated. This is new source of power. Now, in this Realpolitik setting, there are the ingredients for, if I can use another metaphor, for some meal or some pie that we may create, and which would be relatively of a good taste ahead of us. Few key points are there. Therefore, we are speaking openly. There are no sort of hiding behind the big narratives. There are now clear issues are on the table. There are the real interests. Now, what is missing in this line is the space and the time to develop some sort of understanding. Governments are finding shortcuts with bilateral agreements. They're moving fast with regional agreements. And there are not that many spaces. UNGG basically failed with their report. IGF is IGF. And I always say IGF was the result of a compromise, which has some value, concept of compromise, at the WSIS in 2005, because nobody, in principle, both sides were equally unhappy with the IGF. But it was created. It started somehow growing, moving on. And now I think that there is opening for a possible strengthening of the IGF as possible space where some more serious discussion can take place. Not in the current format, not in the current dynamics. There is institutional space thanks to the WSIS regulation and the WSIS plus 10, and Daniel and Larry were involved in negotiation of that. Therefore, IGF could be some space where a few new dynamisms could be created. I know that that question will be criticized by quite a few, but I don't see any other space on global level where we can have that serious discussion.
So I'm going to open it to these guys as well, but just to directly come in on that. Megan, I think quite rightly, spoke about exhaustion. And to a certain extent, this is to do with the various different strands that are going on, but it's also just a very personal thing. There are a lot of conversations that a relatively few number of people either need to be involved in. So two questions. To come in on Jovan's point, what are the institutional opportunities going forward? Is it an expanded or modified IGF? Was it something else? And secondly, what else can we do to mitigate some of that exhaustion? Megan, you raised the issue.
Well, hopefully I'm not speaking out of school, but my memory is that sometime in the summer to fall of 2014, we had a conversation. One of the actors in this space was proposing a series of concentric circles that would go from a regional to a national to an international, largely through we'll call them multi-stakeholder organizations. But given the complexity of the conversations going around, I think Jovan mentioned some of our conversation ahead of time, and particularly in Geneva, there are a variety of multilateral institutions that are talking about issues that obviously have impact on consumers. So do we need to think back to this proposal that I think .1 was, maybe it was part of the .1 effort, to think about these, building a framework of local, regional, national, international organizations that are multi-stakeholder in nature that allow for simple resolution of questions like, how do I get PayPal to, I forget the example that you had, so that those questions are answered quickly by a regional body that regional group that understands the particular characteristics of the local entity that's having an issue, so that in the end these issues don't become so problematic that they ultimately end up bubbling up to essentially the multilateral level. I don't know how conceivable that, how possible that is. I remember that at the time there was particular concern about the organization that might lead this concentric circle building effort. That was ICANN. And as we've seen in the past couple of years, we've seen ICANN sort of take a step back, which my personal view is that that's appropriate. But I do think that because we have the ISTAR community, by that I mean ICANN, IETF, and part of the IAEB, IEEE community, tired? How do we help put more people into that community, but also connect these other issues? I don't know that a UN effort is one that will solve that, because as we've heard, and we know, much of this space is controlled, at least by private actors. And so we need there to be an opportunity for all stakeholders to be at the table. So that's my quick answer.
Jane?
I would agree with Megan and Jess. There have been fatigue, but there are a lot of people out there a lot younger than we are. We honored 25 of them last week. It's just reinvigorating people and communities, but working on the ground, really using almost a grassroots effort. Think of a campaign here in the United States for an election. You go out to the people. You talk to them and listen to what they have to say. And quite frankly, it's the listening that builds that trust. And when there's the trust among the people who are doing what they do, I've had people say to me, thanks for just listening to what I had to say rather than telling me. When you come from developed countries and you go and work at another place, people will say, really? You know, you think that's how it works? And so we have to think about all the different cultural perspectives as well, and not dive too far into the weeds as civil society, because I don't want to sound flaky. There are serious economic and security ramifications, absolutely. But when you're working at the grassroots level to build that cadre, we did it 25 years ago. I had people in Africa say to me, we couldn't go across borders physically. You brought us to a place. So please never doubt the importance of convening humans together in a room, a massive room perhaps, thousands of them maybe. IGF, to Jovan's example, there's a human chemical reaction that happens when people see each other and know each other and know what they're doing. It happens at the IETF, it happened at ICANN, it happens at this WTDC meeting. We're going to go and be a small part of that chemical reaction and figure out where we can push the margin and also have people listen to us. Like some of our agenda is not going to be based on everything at that meeting that we're going to, but we're going to focus on the key things for the Internet Society. Building faith in what we do, having trust in us, because if there's trust in what we do, then they might listen more to that bigger debate, to re-energize this conversation. And or do we, Larry and I were chatting a minute ago about the term multi-stakeholder. Some people hate that term, particularly in governments that are top-down, super top-down. Mike Nelson may agree with that. How do you reinvigorate a conversation that we're all used to, but reboot it? Like, let's talk, how do we talk about this with youth as well, so they're as energized as we are to go out there? Because there's something exciting about working with people at that grassroots level.
Megan, you want to say something?
Just to think back again, to build off of, I think, something that Jane said and something I know that Jovan said, and Sean may or may not can sort of put the Realpolitik layer over this, but one of the things that we've been thinking about at Public Knowledge, initially in the cybersecurity context, but I think it applies more broadly to internet governance, or whichever term we want to use, data policy, is we really think that we need to be thinking about this trajectory in a more sustainable manner. So how do you can build off of the climate change analogies and think about, as users, as corporations, as governments, how are we going to, I don't agree with the use of the term global commons per se, but this is a shared space. So how do we think about and frame our actions around where we want to see this go, less in the means of it can go as simple as building devices that are insecure, that are essentially weakening trust in our current approach to the internet, but as sort of high level to governments who may not be able to control themselves or control their employees who undertake destabilizing actions that ultimately also weaken trust in the current approach.
But given the inclusivity argument swings both ways, and there are many governments who would say that they ought to be more included, and that brings us around to the sort of role of the United Nations in this. It is relevant because I think we are going to see more interest, notwithstanding the challenges with the GGE, more pressure to have the UN involved in this, not least to include some of the countries in the developing world who feel that their voice hasn't been heard. How do you see that dynamic playing out going forward, reconciling this Realpolitik dynamic that we've kind of pretty much achieved consensus on but also the very real role of the private sector and civil society that needs to be incorporated into that.
Good values are always a part of Realpolitik. I mean, if you want to have the conventions observed by countries, you have to involve them in negotiations. There is, well, if I can paraphrase famous saying, there is no implementation without participation. Countries may be forced by big players to sign the treaty, but then they will implement it without a lot of interest. And to implementation of cyber agreements, cyber deals, requires quite capillary, quite atomic interventions in society. It's not like some big bilateral deal in cybersecurity, including, unfortunately, what we are following these days, nuclear deal, which you can deal between countries. For cyber issues, because of the nature of the internet, you have really to find the ways to implement to the level almost of the final user or ISP provider. Therefore, inclusion is a part of Realpolitik. Now, there are two problems. One is easy to address. It's question of UNGG. We just extend the number from 25 to whatever. We have open-ended group, or there are different ideas. But what is becoming a big problem is sort of, what I indicate in email, inclusion is inclusion and illusion. There is a saying, okay, have your say, join the meeting, very genuine, I would say, in all of the spaces like ICANN, like ISOC, like ITU, like different spaces, which are proclamation, you can join, you can have your say. But de facto, small and developing countries, civil society or governments cannot use that possibility. Therefore, it very often creates even frustration. It is something where, okay, we may join, it's open, and usually argument, counter-argument, yeah, but we opened the doors, we invited you. Why you don't join us? You can have your say. And you have a government with mainly maybe one or two experts who have some understanding of cyber issues. And we find it very often in Geneva. Small countries come and say, and they're not ideological on the question of need for the big internet treaty. They have very practical problem. Small mission of 2 or 3 diplomats in Geneva is usually the only place where they can follow digital policy negotiations. And those people are Renaissance diplomats. They start with Red Cross in the morning, they move in the afternoon to human rights, in the evening they get internet governance. Therefore, that element of inclusion, which is not formal, is, in my view, the most delicate. ICANN, ISOC, we are trying to put a lot of efforts to build the capacity, but it is not enough.
What more needs to be done?
First, we have to find a solution which won't be centralization of digital space, to have a place where governments can have simple answer. Like, you know, in Europe you have EasyJet and those companies. People need simple and easy answers. I have a PayPal problem. I mentioned it in our one of the governments in Africa. They came to me and say, how can we solve the PayPal problem of access? I said, we called IMF, they don't have a clue. We called the Bank of International Settlement, they were not necessarily, to tell them, okay, go to IGF and raise your voice would be difficult. Then through some contacts, more personal contacts, I initiated the process. And those are issues which are not big ideological issues. Those are very practical issues. Therefore, there is a need for a space. That could be clearinghouse, that could be something where governments can, and other actors, can voice their concerns. And second point is we need to build institutions. Most of capacity building currently in most of our institutions is focusing on individuals. These individuals are very smart, great people. They help their communities. Sometimes they move to Europe and the United States. But we don't have robust institutions in developing countries. First, governments, but also civil society and business association. And if you need sustainable policy, and if you need real inclusion, you need a solid institutions. And that's, I would say, those are two major challenges: to find a space where people can voice their concerns, not having another big organization, but some clearinghouse, some simple and light structure. And second, to build institutions in developing countries.
I'm going to open it up because we have some extraordinary expertise and knowledge in the audience, apart from anything else. But I'm just going to push on this last point before I do. The clearinghouse idea is one that has been emerging over the course of the last few years. The Net Mundial initiative was an attempt at that. It didn't really kind of take, correct me if I'm wrong, but what's what can this community do? What can governments, private sector do to take that trick? Because I agree, I think it's quite an important one to get right.
There is a gap. Whether that gap will be addressed in one way with a centralized organization or with something which is more in the spirit of multi-stakeholder approach with clearinghouse depends on the stakeholders. That gap has to be filled somehow because there is increasing pressure and there will be more and more requests for that. IGF, for example, in Article 72 of the Versailles Declaration has a possibility to act as a clearinghouse. That's one possibility. There are different ideas like UN OCHA in humanitarian field, but it's more intergovernmental, I would say. One has to reflect the spirit of the internet governance and cybersecurity community, which is more multi-stakeholder. But I think that there are concerns because anything which is sort of centralized in the UN raises some concern on one side, and on other sides is not happy if we don't have new international organization. And this is probably a good space to have some reasonable compromise with check and balances. I think that is extremely important element, transparency and check and balances. If we inbuilt in that structure check and balances, many eyes seeing what's going on, that could be a possible solution for clearinghouse.
Okay, I want to get some other views, but I want to open it up to the audience. Yoon at the back has the microphone. She's one of our interns this year. If you have a question, please raise your hand and give me your name and affiliation. Paul, we'll start with you. You can, so please use the microphone so people online can hear you.
Thank you, Ian. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, I thought those were great presentations, and I think the timing is also...
Well, where are you from?
Oh, sorry, Paul Trillo from Eurasia Group. I think this is a great opportunity to discuss these issues, and I look forward to discussing them further with all the panelists. I think a couple things I didn't hear mentioned, which probably we can talk more about. One is China. I didn't hear the word China once. And the other is I didn't hear terms like WannaCry and NotPetya and some of the recent global issues which I think are helping to propel some of these discussions about the need, for example, for some sort of international body on cybersecurity or other issues to do things like share, threat intelligence globally. So I think this is a particularly interesting time, and I'd like to get your thoughts, panelists' thoughts on the potential for such a I think somebody raised the panel on space. I think that was Sean, right? So the potential for something like the Committee on Space, the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, something like some structure like that, working in the cyber world, because who knows? Maybe it's something like that will be proposed in the near future, and how that might work, and what are some of the constraints on that, and why is outer space different than cyberspace? But I think it sounds as though there's sort of a building pressure to do something at that level. I think that with the apparent failure of the GGE, people are wondering, what's the next step on this? And simply expanding the GGE may be one option, but I think there seems to be a growing sense that maybe some different approach is needed. So I'd like to get the panel's thoughts.
So Sean first. If say the Chinese come out and propose a big new UN body to do what you described, what's the appropriate response, and how do you see that actually playing out?
Well, I'm going to go back to my statement earlier of who can actually do something to resolve the problem at hand. I think there are very few things that anyone in the consumer marketplace would turn to the UN to solve in a timely and cost-effective manner. So I would ask the question, who would and could actually do something about it? Now you're seeing this locally or regionally. You're seeing it in certain sectors. Here in the United States, some of our major financial institutions have started a new information sharing platform to try to protect that sector, and I know there's an interest in them growing to include smaller and medium-sized institutions, and then internationally. Self-help, solving the problem within that sector. I'm very familiar with some of the, I'll call it the internet infrastructure operators who are interested in improving the cyber hygiene of the ecosystem. We've seen some of the work that companies like Microsoft have done with the FBI to eliminate botnets, a well-celebrated public-private partnership effort there. There are examples from foreign jurisdictions. I'm giving the US examples because those are some that are most readily available to me. But each of those examples isn't a value-based origin necessarily, or an ideological one. It was a, here's a problem that needs to be solved and who can do it. So, I mean, talk about the UN. I mean, I'm familiar with the multi-year effort that I think was the ITU had to try to set up something I believe called Impact in Malaysia years back that never really got off the ground to fruition. We can all speculate on why that was, and people may have different optics on it, but the answer is Impact is not providing you your cybersecurity today. Okay, there was a vision for it to be doing that many years ago. Do I think the ITU is going to be where the rubber meets the road? Not necessarily. When you're getting DDoS, do you call the ITU, or do you go buy more bandwidth from Akamai? It's quite obvious how the problems actually get solved. So I'm going to keep coming back to the Realpolitik question, not the politics side of it, but the realism side of it. Who can? And a couple of terms I heard discussed up here were distrust, multiple times, citizens and users distrusting governments, governments distrusting companies, governments distrusting other governments, who they're negotiating with at the UN and then conducting espionage against and covert actions against the following day. And the other word, starting from the Max Weber discussion, the frustration. What you have here is governments who feel they don't have the ability to control or direct this primary activity upon which their whole social, political, and economic structure is dependent. You have private sector entities who have the ability to control on a day-to-day basis, but you have the real genesis of desire from the user base who wants functionality and real-time convenience. They can put pressure on the companies who will respond in a market sense, and they can put pressure on governments who in many jurisdictions will respond at a political level. Some jurisdictions you don't have those democratic steam release valves. But I would look at the actual dynamics of how you do this. I wish the UN the best, and I think they've done some great things over time, and I hope they continue to do more. I don't think that's the cost-effective, timely solution. And I actually don't think the global consumer base who wants their social media, who wants global interoperability, is prepared to wait for that.
I'm going to take another question. People can come in and sort of comment on that because it's a big thing. We'll go on this side, and then we'll come to you, Mike.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your presentations. I'm from American University. I'm the doctoral program there, working on internet governance and privacy issues. I'm actually quite interested. I'm from India, and I'm very interested in finding out what you think about countries like India that kind of made a transition from multilateral stance towards internet governance to this so-called multi-stakeholder model, and how much of it is really, as you say, realpolitik to get other kind of maybe bargains sought to change, but in reality they remain very much multilateral kind of form of governance where they do want the Indian government in the driver's seat, but on the veneer, it seems that they've sided with multi-stakeholder. Thank you.
So I might kick it off by saying that in some countries, and I'll put myself back, 15 years ago when I was living in a small country in Eastern Europe, and I suggested to the regulator that we were helping strengthen that we have a forum with the ISPs, Internet Service Providers, and that we needed to create a group so that we could look at different issues in the country. It almost turned into a fight, and it was literally, no one had ever done this before, literally brought the private sector and others to meet with government because government was used to, and I used to be government, so I'm empathetic, I'm sympathetic, empathetic, all of these things. And I thought, gosh, I was in government and I talked to people when I worked in the United States. So why isn't this working? Well, they had never, their authority shouldn't be questioned according to them. And so we had another meeting about 2 months later when I assured myself that they wouldn't start to punch each other, because they almost did, that we had to continue to try to have the discussions. In the beginning, and others have said this to me about developing policy in Kenya, to be honest, submarine cable policy, you have to sit with each other, looking at each other, versus back to front in a room. And you have to keep going so that you reach a point where you can work with each other. And the reason I'm creating this, giving you this example, is that I'm working with some people in India right now on these community network discussions, places where people don't have connectivity. They can't get backhaul out to the larger global internet. And they can't do that because the mast they put up was too high and supposedly in the village according to certain standards. Well, they don't have a way to get the Indian government to stop, to help them understand better what to do, except for now that they're discussing this with the Indian government. But they're seen as a pain in the neck because these villages are less than 3,000 people or fewer. So the question is, can you create a public forum to have that discussion where people don't embarrass each other? Because quite frankly, when I was a government official, the last thing you want is for someone to come in and scream at you in a public forum. You're going to have that no matter what, right? And so I think there has to be some way we level that discourse. How is it that we can all come together, Realpolitik or not, and have that conversation? Now, this is a former communist country that I was working in, and it finally did work because you had to establish some modicum of trust, some layer, right? And I think in the UN space, you also are trying to do that at some level. There are countries that don't love what someone has to say from another government because of certain issues, whether it's human rights or other, but you still have to respect each other.
So let me make a controversial proposition. Could it be argued that just at the point where within the internet community, multi-stakeholderism has become the orthodoxy, the likes of Brazil and then India and even China, at least formally, are sort of at least learning the language, that the wider geopolitical trends have actually pushed the debate the other way, and that with the sort of apparently governments interfering in the elections of other countries, that geopolitics are actually putting governments back in the driving seat because of things outside of the internet community. How much space is that kind of bottom-up effort going to be given against concerns about security, be they WannaCry or governments interfering in elections and other issues? In other words, is this too important to be left to the IGF and the internet community?
There is one important way, what Jane mentioned, and the aspect is that the more you get to the closer to user, the more you diffuse ideological twist in discussion. The higher you move with the lift elevator into the geopolitics, the issues are becoming more ideological because they become part of the trade-off on the global diplomatic agenda. I scratch your back on this issue and you scratch mine on the other. Therefore, that is important, but again, inclusion here has a very, very practical value, because strictly speaking, you cannot have effective digital policy without definitely private sector around the table in the issues of social media, and I would say even civil society or user community, whatever, consumer organization. Therefore, if it is labeled and contextualized, first de-ideologized, moved lower on the sort of this elevator level, and then explain to the governments that they can benefit. And I can tell you, whenever I go to governments, including governments who are against multi-stakeholderism, when you explain them that they can benefit practically by having their technical experts around the table, they like it. They don't like their multi-stakeholderism, but de facto, they like, because they will have more expertise. Therefore, they can control their staff in the ministry if something for their advices. They may win next elections because they will look cool with digital community, and you give them points which are very, very practical. I think we have a major challenge in communication. Selling the multi-stakeholderism as an ideological concept is very dangerous. If it is put in the very practical level, my experience, direct experience in interacting in Geneva, in developing countries, is that people are quite okay. You know, they're ready to. There are elements of saving the face. They don't want to be exposed to the criticism in public in some cultures because of the cultural specificities. But all of those issues can be done. Therefore, in brief, reduce the ideological tension, bring all people who can help in practical way. For example, in cybersecurity. I know in cybersecurity circles, they're a bit worried about multi-stakeholder approach. But cybersecurity is per se multi-stakeholder issue. Because you need the companies, you need the governments, you need the users, you need digital hygiene, you need all of those elements. And you need to have all of these people on the table.
Mike, and then we'll come across.
Mike Nelson, Cloudflare. It's hard to know anything about politics and policy, but one thing you can count on is that the more powerful the policymaker, the less depth and detail they will have about an issue, because they have to cover so many issues. And I guess there's also Jovan's law, which is that Renaissance diplomats, which make up most diplomats, also have a pretty broad portfolio and therefore can't get very deep. So I have a very specific problem that we've been struggling with, which is that for a lot of these powerful people, the internet is what is on their screen. And so when they see a problem, they want to regulate the internet. And they don't understand the stack. They don't know the difference between Verizon and VeriSign and Facebook and the different roles they have. They don't know the role of the financial industry and even the electric power grid that make this all possible. They just want the internet to solve the problem. So do the four of you have any suggestions on how we can more effectively communicate to these people that it's really different if your job, like Cloudflare's, is to just move the bits efficiently? Now, that's very different than Facebook, which is to build an online community and to actually moderate and curate the content.
Megan. Sorry.
One of the thoughts, this is a rather, well, I'm thinking aloud, so not a very well-baked idea, that's the phrase I was looking for. So, and the practicality of this may be quite remote. But I think, you know, there may be an opportunity for organizations basically getting the stack together and doing, I mean, this is pretty maybe naive, by doing trainings regionally or locally together with ISOC chapters. So you can envision, and I think we need to be, we, as most of us here on the panel, need to be cautious about the approach that's taken in the faces, both the faces, but also the companies that are at the table. But I think if we could work to a place where there are partnerships among peering partners and financial institutions in different regions that are able to sit down together and explain, you know, in, I don't know if it's a day, and I know it's hard to get these diplomats time, but I do think that there's, you know, diplomats and staff can talk to each other as much as we want. But I think in some places it probably sounds and resonates a little bit more coming from the actual operators, and in many places, but not all, that's corporations. And so I think I would urge you to work together with some of the other companies in the room and your international partners to try and think about a way to do kind of a crash course. Because I think, you know, for a while there was a time where it was kind of, it is the screen, but I think there are so many actions being taken that can be really destabilizing by some of these countries, and whether they be at the local level or the nation state level, that we can no longer sort of wave our hands and say the internet's going to fix it. I think we need to teach them a little bit more. So teach them to fish, sort of, in a good way.
Maybe we need an app that explains the net ecosystem.
Last question.
Thank you. My name's David Satola. I'm from the World Bank. Thank you for New America and the panel for this great discussion. I wanted to pick up on a point that Jovan mentioned in his forecast, and that's the role of the courts and the judiciary in these trends. And I'd like to hear the panel's views on what they think. I mean, so far, ISPs and over-the-top providers have mostly avoided intermediary liability. And I foresee that in the next year or so that's not going to be the case. There will be cases coming out about how those ISPs and over-the-top providers are going to be liable for content and are going to be liable for the content that their users use those platforms for. So I'd like to hear your views on what you think the impact of intermediary liability might be on the development and the sort of whole discussion about internet governance. Thanks.
Jovan, you raised the issue, and perhaps to link it to your sort of localization issue, how much does it matter that different parts of the world may well have different jurisdictions and courts that come up with sort of different views, and what does that mean for the idea of a single global internet?
Well, that's bring a challenge to one notion, that it's notion of cyberspace. I always challenge my students, and fail some of them, who do not provide the reasons to explain what a cyberspace is. Now you have Chinese cyberspace authority, NATO have the cyberspace as a fifth or fourth operational domain, but they always have a difficulty. They said, tell me, where is the cyberspace out of the physical space? Data, traveling computers, and other issues. Therefore, it brings us to the question of jurisdiction and the question of the local content. What we'll be having governments basically imposing their role over their portion of cyberspace. Within the caveats, which we already discussed, that they don't want to ruin the cyberspace, global cyberspace, because they can benefit for their social economic development, and at the end the users will remind them, stop that funny measures like people are doing now in London. Now, one clear tendency within this court bubble is the tendency towards the liability of all providers of the services. It's coming recently from different angles. It's coming from the anti-terrorism angle with Theresa May and the French government last week in the UN. It's coming from the fake news angle in Europe. Therefore, there will be increasing pressure for it. And basically, the logic of government is very simple. You are benefiting from the internet message to companies. You have to be liable. You cannot be just shielded from the previous narrative that internet economy is different. And that's basically a strong message, and we can see that it's currently on political level. We can expect over the next year and a half spill over into the legal system. And I would say first serious court cases, mainly in a European Court of Justice, by other courts along this line of the liability, intermediary liability. Therefore, this is definitely a clear trend that we can envisage in the forthcoming period.
Go ahead.
I think another area of liability that we can look forward to probably is that of software and hardware manufacturing entities. They have thus far also similarly been outside the realm of courts, and while we may not see that directly as an internet governance issue, I think one could argue that capacity in cybercrime and cybersecurity are essential elements of the current approach to internet governance. So,
go on, Sean.
I think you're going to increasingly see regulatory and tort liability issues coming up here. I think criminal liability won't come in. I think the common carrier concept will prevail in that respect. And sir, I think your question for me ties directly to Mr. Nelson's question, is I would personally hope that we'll start to get some courts with expertise in this area, the way we have intellectual property cases brought in the Ninth Circuit, and the way we have the Delaware Chancery Court in the United States making some of the most important corporate law decisions. With all due respect to people who have public service careers, I think the European Court of Justice case showed an immense lack of sophistication on international financial markets and on how technology works. So they didn't solve the problem. They kicked it down the road. I'm sure the case will get back to them a couple more times. We've already seen renegotiations of the safe harbor for anyone who does transatlantic business, looked at that ruling and said, naive. Now, can that court possibly later come out with a more sophisticated, helpful answer? Possibly. But I think you're going to need to get some expertise in your judiciary, and then you will have court cases which will then set the standard.
So just picking up on that theme, just to wrap up, I'd like to sort of come down the line, starting with Jane. We've put out there a lot of concerns, and a few are good ideas, including the one Sean just mentioned, that we would like to see to start to sort of drive events in a positive direction. So in wrapping up, Jane, sorry to put you on the spot, but one big idea that you and your colleagues would like to see with some additional focus in the next year or two within the internet governance space.
continue to build bottom-up governance through the capacity building, as Megan had mentioned, and not give up. We are tired, some of us, but there are a lot of people who are not tired and still want to learn. The old policies that were in place need to be shifted into some new policy realms to cover all of these different issues. So it means engagement across different stakeholder groups in different fora, and to work together to do that. I mean, we really have to push it on the collaborative side to keep things open, and transparency is critical in a lot of these conversations.
Sean.
Watch India. It's 1 billion people. They speak English. It's the world's largest democracy. They have the world's largest biometric database for social services. They are an Asian culture. They have traditional ethnic communities. They reflect a lot of what's happening in a lot of different countries. The Singh to Modi government transition, multilateral to multi-stakeholderism, and a lot of the other smaller developing countries look to them because they may not trust US, Russia, China, et cetera, in this cyberspace. And when I say watch India, India's National Cyber Conference is next week, Sci-Fi, and then next month, India is hosting the biannual London process meeting, the Global Conference on Cybersecurity. So if you're interested in where the future of internet governance is going, keep an eye on India this fall. Lots going to be happening there.
Megan.
I guess to my slightly half-baked idea that I was suggesting to Mike, I think, while yes, there is an opportunity for governments to come in and really take this in a real Realpolitik direction, I think there's similarly an opportunity for corporations and civil society to work together to bring some proposals together so that a more forward-looking and interoperable future is what we find ourselves in, and less of a kind of retrograde Realpolitik regulatory state.
Finish this off, Jovan. What's the big idea that we should take away to take the global internet in a positive direction?
Probably, to quote the Churchill, the further forward you want to see, the further backward you have to look. We have been around this big stone in the middle of a sort of Milky Way or whatever for millions, thousands of years. There is a lot of wisdom based on basic humanity, more recently based on great thinkers of enlightenment, great thinkers of India, China. And there are the common points which we can refer to in the very heated debate. It was my message to the last conference, World Internet Conference in China, because I was referring to the common points in the history between Chinese philosophy and European and Indian philosophies. Therefore, we have to avoid the chrono-narcissism, that we think that everything is happening now, and we have to be more humble and down to earth and build trust in way out. Trust in us and trust in our history and future.
Thank you. That's, I think, perfect note on which to end. There is clearly a great deal more conversation. We look forward to having people back to continue the conversation. But I think it is clear that as the physical and virtual worlds collide, governments are going to get more engaged in these topics. But as they do, the need to engage the private sector and civil society even more actively becomes even more apparent. And conversations like that, I think, will help that. So please join me in thanking Jen Coffin, Sean Kanuck, Megan Stifel, and Jovan Kurbalija. Yes.
Almost there.
Okay,
Almost there.
thank you.